Hi, everyone. So I'm Chelsea Schmidtke. I support the National Urban Indigenous Coalitions Council on day-to-day business at an administrative level. And I'm here today with some council members and some coalition leaders from across the country. We're really excited to welcome everyone in the room today for an event that's part of our speaker series entitled Stories Have Always Been Our Governance. So we've been hosting these virtual sessions over the last about year or so, every couple of months or monthly if we can, as a means of bringing together voices on topics of interest to urban Indigenous community members, as a way of sharing information and bringing together voices on important topics. So I just wanted to give some space for Erwin, part of the organization's communication lead, and someone who's helping to hold together NUIC's Indigenous Knowledge Mobilization Hub, of which this speaker series is a part. And I'll let him introduce himself.
Okay, good. Thanks, Chelsea. So just welcome everybody, and great to see a lot of folks here. I think there'll be people trickling in over the next 15 minutes, so we'll try to resolve that. And specifically excited to have a conversation on coalitions, as the NUIC National Council has asked for more knowledge and more sharing between coalitions to really examine what makes a strong coalition and why are coalitions unique to organizations or nonprofits. So there's some really beautiful stories we'll hear today from different parts of the country, and excited to see that happen. And we'll be recording it also because I'm anticipating some really interesting questions and some dialogue around how people want to increase their learning and ramp up and deepen their knowledge of what makes a successful coalition, and maybe how are some challenges overcome. So those stories will hopefully also walk their way into the toolkit that we're producing so that the coalitions across the country can have a better sharing and good practices around coalitions. So you'll perhaps hear some Q&A today that might trickle into our coalitions toolkit as well. So good to see everybody. And we have our hosts for the discussion, Ian Peach, and welcome, Ian, and thank you for taking the time. And you're out we're on the West Coast and you're on the East Coast. It's good to have this representation across the country, and I know you bring a lot of knowledge around research and governance and administration, and you've been hired by the New Brunswick Aboriginal Peoples Council to do this work. So thanks for joining us today. And you're also one of the members of NUIC's National Council. I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm pleased to be here to be able to facilitate, in part because New Brunswick is just beginning to build coalitions. So I've got a lot to learn. And I'm excited by the prospect of learning from our speakers today. I will introduce them in the order in which they are in the slides. And if someone with more talent with the slides can run them through as I do an introduction. Lindsay Swooping Hawk Kretschmer from the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council. Welcome, Lindsay. And our second speaker will be Tom Howard from the Battlefords Regional Community Coalition in Saskatchewan. Hi, Tom. Tanya Claremont from the, as it says here, Victoria Native Friendship Center and the Victoria Urban Reconciliation Dialogue. Nice to have you with us, Tanya. And then Leilani Shaw. Leilani is here representing the Montreal Network, and look forward to hearing from you as well, Leilani. Now, to begin with, I want each of you to give a very brief, and I'm going to have to be strict on this, very brief introduction to your coalitions, a tiny bit about how old it is, how many members, that sort of basic statistical stuff. So if we could, we might as well do this in order. If we could begin with you, Lindsay.
Yeah, we'll go. Thanks, Ian. Sego, good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be here with you today. So quick introduction. Again, my name is Lindsay Kretschmer. My spirit name is Swooping Hawk. I'm second generation urban Indigenous status Indian. My background is Mohawk and German, linked to 6 nations of the Grand River Territory and Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm a mom to 3 kids, a cousin, an auntie, and friend to many. My education background is in business and marketing, and I'm the current executive director of TASK, coming up on 5 years working with TASK. And in terms of who TASK is, in the context of centering ourselves in Toronto, territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and home to many diverse nations today. Very fortunate to get to work with a group of really amazing individuals that make up TASK's coalition. We are currently an 18-member coalition, but growing into soon to be a 21 or 22-member coalition, which is very exciting. We have been around since the 1990s. We were an informal group of folks that came together for the purposes, like I'm sure many coalitions did, for unity, for better communication, for better collaboration, and for information sharing. And so informally, we were established in the 90s. We produced a major report, one of the most informative reports of its time on urban Indigenous folks in the city of Toronto, that also had 58 recommendations for improvement. That was 10 years ago now that report was produced. We became incorporated in 2011 officially, and we've grown, as I said, from 5 to currently 18 and still growing. I recognize I'm going to come up on time, but just in the context of Toronto, it's estimated that there's around 80,000 or more of us living here, which is double the count of what census puts us at in 2016. Often that's an undercount in any case. Toronto is 4th most populous in the country for urban Indigenous populations. In the context of Ontario, we are the most populous in the country for Indigenous populations. Again, if we're looking at Stats Can, albeit not fully accurate. And we have about 86% of us that are in fact living off reserve in the context of Ontario. This is evidently where we live, according to the Toronto heat map, where the blue squares in terms of we're located in the city. So as you can see, we're everywhere, but for some reason not in the north. I'm pretty sure those folks didn't participate in the census. That could be why. These are some of our members. You may recognize them. We are very fortunate that we have a really diverse group of Indigenous-led, Indigenous-governed, non-for-profit organizations who have been working for decades collectively and individually to serve the needs of our folks here. And they do work with TASK collectively on all of these things and then some toward bettering the well-being overall for urban Indigenous folks in a city like Toronto, where we are often overlooked. I think the value of TASK's coalition in particular is that we are able to work together in collaboration by consensus to elevate our collective voice for research, policy, and advocacy issues usually, but not always. Oftentimes, just coming to the table enables our coalitions to be able to partner, to advance on local issues, and to support community members who need it most. I think I'll stop there because I'm coming up on time. I do have more slides, so if we get to the next question, maybe I'll share those.
Thank you very much. And you came in well ahead of time. Much appreciated. So next, I would ask Tom to provide a bit of a backgrounder on the Battlefords Coalition.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone on the call today. Tom Howard. I'm the coordinator for the Battlefords Regional Community Coalition, calling in from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon today, actually. The Battlefords Regional Community Coalition is a government-to-government leadership table formed in the Battlefords. In 2018, the agreement that underlies our coalition actually passed in 2019. And we mainly work with our members are in 3 capacities: advocacy, coordination, and special projects. So we're a coalition of 5 First Nations governments and 2 municipal governments. That would be Little Pine, Lucky Man, Moosomin, Soto, and Sweetgrass, with the city of North Battleford and the town of Battleford. So the origins of the Battlefords Regional Community Coalition really stem back to the aftermath of the Gerald Stanley trial. So in the aftermath of the Gerald Stanley trial, the mayor of North Battleford asked a retiring oil field consultant to put together a no agenda workshop with all of the nations, the Health Authority, the RCMP, the Métis Nation, to basically get together and talk about how relationships could be improved, how everybody can work together. A series of meetings followed that workshop at which 5 nations and the 2 municipalities agreed that there was merit and value in working together in a more formal coalition arrangement. So that led to the signing of the Saskatchewan Relationship Agreement in 2019, which really sets out the vision, mission, mandate of the BRCC and is effectively our terms of reference. The BRCC was incorporated as a nonprofit in 2020, at which point I was hired as its first employee, as it turns out. So in terms of the services for the Battlefords region, the Battlefords are a community that's about halfway between Saskatoon and Lloydminster in West Saskatchewan. In terms of the regional footprint, it's about 35,000 people. The official stats are that urban Indigenous members are about 20% of the population in the city of North Battleford. And the town of Battleford, although those numbers are a little bit higher, there's about 9 nations, 10 depending on how you slice and dice, that compose that region. And so it's a bigger urban center for where we are in Saskatchewan. It's a hub for services, for health services, for any kind of social services for the nations in the region. So the 2 mayors, 5 chiefs sit on our board of directors. We come together 5-6 times a year to engage with the RCMP and to vote on project work brought forward by the project team on the BRCC. And some of the bigger projects that we've been working on an anti-racism initiative that I think I'll talk about in the next question. I won't chew up all my time talking about that now. We've been working on developing a regional emergency management plan, which we're actually just in the process of getting approved. Doing a public engagement project with our member communities on health, education, recreation services in the region. We've been doing ongoing pandemic coordination between our 7 member governments, and the list goes on. So maybe I'll stop myself there, try not to eat into everybody else's time too much and to save time for the other coalitions. So I'll thank you and keep things moving there.
Thank you. And I'll now ask Tanya to tell us a bit about Victoria.
Okay, so the Victoria Coalition started in 2018, and our journey's been a little bit different because our group formed before we became a coalition, and so we have a few things happening at the same time of overlapping work that has now become our full coalition work that has been interwoven together. So our programming or our table is hosted through the Victoria Native Friendship Centre, which is the largest Indigenous service providing agency in our region, and we've been in service to community for 53 years. We work within the traditional territories of the Wapungan peoples and the Wasanich people, and we appreciate their hospitality and graciousness in allowing us to do this work here in their communities. We have a pretty complex space that we work within in terms of who can be at the table with us at any time. We are the capital regional district, so we're the provincial capital, which means one that the provincial government is based here, and so we have the wonderful opportunity to meet people face to face and go knock on doors when we need to. And so recognizing that that's really a benefit to us in the work that we do. So the capital region covers about all of South Vancouver Island from the Malahat south. The current population based on the 21 stats that just came out is around 415,000 people cumulative. That includes the islands. There's lots of small islands around the south. You can see all the circles around the outside. Those are all the municipalities within the Capital Regional District. And so there are 16 of them that function within the area that we provide services to. And that is the community that we're trying to gather and communicate with. In that space, there's about 20,000 Indigenous people, and we represent about 5% of the population here. And 85% of that number are people that are not from the ancestral territory. So a lot of our community members are living away from their own territories and spaces. We also have 10 First Nations in our area, and they are doing their own work in the space as well. And so maneuvering between those spaces and making sure that we're respecting the protocols and wishes of the local communities, but also progressing the space in the urban spaces. And a lot of all of these nations, you know, have reserves that are surrounded by urban space. And so while they are reserved, there are, you know, 10 reserves in our community. These people on a regular basis are coming off the reserve and into community and accessing services and schooling and all those other wonderful things that we have available. And so we do really need to contemplate the entire 20,000 people when we're talking about the work we do, because just because somebody goes home at night and puts their head down, you know, in their own territory on reserve, it doesn't mean that they don't need support in the urban spaces that we have. Okay, I won't switch. There. So when I think about the work that our coalition is doing, when I say we structured a little bit different, you know, we have the CRD and we have the whole, you know, 415,000 people that are living and residing in this area. Then we have VERD, which is our Victoria Urban Reconciliation Dialogue. This is the place we started in 2018. The Friendship Center wanted to step into a space where we were proactively approaching reconciliation with community partners. And so we invited community representatives from different agencies and all the levels of government, municipal, regional, provincial, and federal. And we met and we became the steering committee who began hosting events for our community. And our journey for the first 3 years was a listening journey. We wanted to know what we needed to do here in this community of Victoria with these people that live here in this time. You know, what are the things that we need to progress and what are our successes that we can build into? So the VERD community is for all our residents here in the CRD. And so Indigenous, non-Indigenous, you're welcome into that space to work with us. But it became really clear that we also needed a dedicated space to Indigenous voice, particularly in relation to BC passing the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and our need to be able to engage and contribute to the conversation of how that was going to be implemented and the action plan that has since been developed. And so we reached out into our VERD community and we put a call out and saying, we need some community leaders to come to the table and work with us to do that. That Indigenous voice specific work. And so through self-selection, self-nomination, and a few targeted invites, we created the Greater Victoria Urban Indigenous Community Leadership Table. This is an open space where any member of the community can self-select in to sit. We define leaders to be people who have a committed relationship with this community, who have a lived experience as an Indigenous person, whatever that is for them, whatever that reality is for them, and that they have a voice they want to share, and a community that they're trying to help, and peers that they're trying to help bring voice forward for. And so it's a very organic, open space. We have, we had 10 members originally when we put the call out, and then now we fluctuate around 20. And again, we're continually trying to figure out how to grow and nurture that space. So it is.
Intervene, Tanya,
okay.
To ask you to wrap. I'm sorry.
Okay, and so there you are. I'll use my next slides like somebody else. Yeah, we'll use the next slides like Lindsay in the next part.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. And now I'll ask Leilani to tell us a bit about Montreal.
What Gwenwaradu Zewagwegu. Hi, everyone. My name is Leilani Shah. I am Mohawk from Kahnawake, and I'm a member of the Turtle Clan. The organization I work with is the Montreal Indigenous Community Network, which is a nonprofit organization servicing and supporting the Indigenous community here, including organizations, both Indigenous and Indigenous serving. Organization, which really helps us kind of categorize our members in terms of those who require more support and more accompaniment, if you will, and those who, you know, still need to be around the table because they are servicing a very important population. Montreal, I think, in our last census has around, I think, 32,000 Indigenous people in the greater Montreal area, so on and off the island. But for most organizations, our estimation is closer to 50,000. This is mostly due to the fact that many Indigenous people do not participate in census, and you have to have a fixed address to participate in census. So often this leaves out a huge amount of the population that either is homeless in homelessness or doesn't have a fixed address, so they're couch surfing or other things. So for the network, we support around 12 to 15 Indigenous organizations. We really gather all of these members to discuss really important topics, whether that's around, like I mentioned, homelessness, children in care, health, social services, culture, etc. So we host these really important discussion spaces, bring all the people who need to be there around the table, and then support those conversations. We also include, like I mentioned, around 15 other Indigenous serving organizations. So these are not organizations that do not consider themselves Indigenous, but they either hire Indigenous staff or a lot of their clientele or their community that they serve are Indigenous. So we at the network focus a lot on research. We have many multi-year research programs or projects, including developing community plans. So we are able to host a 2-year research with urban Indigenous youth and to really support these conversations so that they can identify the barriers that affect them, as well as the solutions that they want to see in the future. We have really important relationships with every level of government, so municipal, provincial, and federal. Federal probably being the easiest relationship to have. The province is an interesting relationship. It's still there, but it is quite difficult to navigate. And then the city of Montreal as well. So we've existed since 2008. From 2008 to 2018, it was only ever 1 employee. So when we incorporated in 2019, we had around 5 employees. Since then, we're now a team of around 20, including part-time, full-time, and contract workers. So we also focus on different awareness tools, including we just launched our Indigenous Ally Toolkit a couple of years ago. Most recently, we launched our Decolonial Toolbox, which is an online tool that has many different levels for those who are interested in allyship or other just general knowledge about Indigenous people. So it kind of alleviates that burden that's consistently placed on Indigenous people to educate non-Indigenous people when it comes to the realities here. So I think that's it for now, but I'll definitely jump into more conversations soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now on to the substantive opportunity, your opportunity to inspire folks like me who are just trying to figure out how to start to build a coalition up. Building a strong coalition inevitably involves confronting challenges. I'd be curious if you can give us a bit of an overview of sort of what your challenges were, what the, maybe the most frustrating one, where the strength came from for the coalition to overcome those challenges and build capacity, and what strategies you use. So I think we'll go back to you, Lindsay. Yeah.
Yeah, well, go. Thank you. It was really great to hear from everyone in terms of what you're doing in your respective spaces. I see a sort of common thread of, this idea of unity, collaboration, coming together for common purpose. And I think for us, probably like many in the sectors around us, the pandemic was definitely a big teacher for us. In that, I think it brought us really close together, and yet somehow far apart in that virtual space where you can't have spirit to spirit, heart to heart conversations or communication. We saw some unprecedented challenges. The gaps that communities were facing here in Toronto were already, I think, very evident to the service providers who have been doing the work of the people, like I said, here for decades. But I think the pandemic really did shine a very bright light on how much that we lack parity with other Torontonians in the city. We did a lot of work. We worked rapidly to assemble our coalition leadership to come together at the onset of the pandemic to create planning tables, to do fundraising. We had coalitions mobilizing and acting in unprecedented ways in terms of the responses that were needed. And we were advocating strongly behind the scenes to various funders for greater flexibility and self-determination with respect to COVID relief funding and how it could be utilized such that each independent member agency that was responding at that time could activate responses that made the most sense, because Toronto is a very big city. And so what might be happening in one part of the city might look very different in another part. And also respecting that each of our coalition members holds a very specific or unique mandate. Some are multi-service in nature, some are housing providers, some are child welfare, some are employment, some are two-spirited serving. So we do have, I think, a full suite of service providers around our table. And they worked really, really well together and very, very strongly to support our communities in the ways that only we know how to respond. And so I think some of the challenges that we faced during the pandemic, again, was the not being able to be together in person, not being able to see each other sort of face to face to be able to communicate in the best way I think we know how. I think what that has done for us is in some ways created a bit of distance, because the greatest strength, I think, for Task as a coalition is our relationships. I think we're really fortunate that a lot of the people around our table have been here and in their respective roles for a very long time. Some are newer, which is also fantastic, because you have, that bridging of knowledge and the gap between, some of the older folks who have been doing the work for a very long time. Some of the younger folks are coming in to learn. And so that transmission of knowledge from the past in terms of, the whole social service sector movement for urban Indigenous space like Toronto, it really is a vibrant city made up of, if we're saying 80,000 or more Indigenous folks live here, and we're thinking, we have an estimated 26 registered non-for-profit Indigenous organizations, most of which make up Task's membership. I think it's pretty incredible that with only a handful of organizations, we're able to meet the needs of thousands collectively. Some of the other interesting things that we did do during the pandemic was we did produce a retrospective review of the TARP report I mentioned earlier, one of the largest studies of its time conducted with and for Indigenous folks, with the 58 recommendations of how we can do better. And what we discovered in that retrospective review is that the three key issues that we were confronted with 10 years ago are the same three key issues we're now confronted with today, which is poverty, visibility, and racism, in and among other, of course, issues above that. But I think it took us to a place of having to think more deeply about not just producing yet another report or another document or another action plan that everyone gets excited about and then later can sit on a shelf. I think we had some really good thinkers and some really bright minds around the table who said, well, let's create this cross-sector table. And so we assembled a prosperity table, as we loosely called it, which was made up of various folks from different governments, different sectors, philanthropic, corporate, and we put our minds together to begin conversations about how we can activate change-making through the retrospective review and the findings. Task was also successful in getting a building just on the tail end of the pandemic coming out of, so that we have a future home for all of us to gather and come together, because we did lose our space like many did during the pandemic. And I guess I'll leave by sort of my last thought by saying that, I think we're very fortunate that we have very gifted people around the table. Sometimes as coalition coordinators or leaders, it's not easy to work with a variety of personalities, but our folks are pretty awesome. So if they're watching, shout out. I know my boss is watching, so I'm going to score some points there. But I do want to acknowledge Francis Sanderson, the president of TASC, because typically you don't work very closely with your president in most board structures. I have the good fortune of a very close working relationship with my board. The coalition members are very active, very supportive, and yeah, TASC is pretty awesome. So I just want to leave it at that. Noah.
Wonderful, thanks very much. I think I might mix things up a little bit if I have all the speakers' consent. So, Leilani, I'm curious what's been building in Montreal, how you've done it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I share something similar to Lindsay of seeing, just the way that we were able to solidify ourselves throughout the pandemic, but really come together as a community. And, like I mentioned, like from around 2018, we are only 5 employees, and now we have a team of around 20. And with that, and funding has definitely increased. So the amount of work and the amount of attention we're able to give to different things has definitely increased. But throughout, we definitely seen, I know we can kind of talk about forever about the effects of the pandemic, especially related to our communities, but it is a really significant turning point for a lot of organizations or a lot of coalitions, because the pandemic has shown or exposed the cracks in the system that have existed for years, but on such a huge amount on such a grand scale that it was inignorable. People could not ignore these problems anymore. So whether that's related to mental health, homelessness, food insecurity, the housing shortage that we're all facing, it's quite remarkable what we're able to do now. Some of the things that we were able to do during the pandemic was we were speaking with public health on a weekly basis, sometimes a couple times a week, trying to figure out what was happening. At one point, the network took on the responsibility of purchasing and distributing PPE, while the government did not have enough supplies. So we were purchasing from tattoo shops and other places just to keep our community members safe. And what has kind of also shifted for us is now we have really solidified relationships with the governments because they could not get the funding out fast enough for the needs that were on the ground. So they approached us since we had a kind of really good scope of what was happening in this really strong partnerships with our members, organizational members, that they were able to provide us with funding to distribute to the organizations directly. So we started handling contribution agreements and funding. We haven't been set up to be a funding body, but we have kind of organically shifted into this that for now is really appreciated by the organizations, since we have, we've been advocating for years for different funding structures, because we know, all of the organizations here know how difficult funding applications are, but also how difficult the reporting is. Reporting can take up, it is sometimes a full-time job. And, we're kind of talking about reporting for something that's like less than $30,000, which, could seem a lot for smaller organizations, but for organizations that are well established, $30,000 is not a lot of money to be reporting on. That takes up, a huge chunk of your time. So we were able to kind of alleviate that burden with organizations, and we were really supporting initiatives that we understood and we know that have a tremendous amount of impact, whether that's accompaniment or other things. So it's really great to see. And maybe one last thing I wanted to add is, at least for me, Montreal and Quebec in general seems significantly behind when it comes to initiatives across Canada. For example, we do not currently have an Indigenous health center. We do not have a cultural center that exists here in Montreal. I should preface in Montreal. And this is for various reasons. And kind of my understanding and analysis of this is one of the huge barriers that we face is just white Francophone Quebecers. These are the people in leadership positions. These are the people in power. And quite often when we do allyship workshops, we've noticed that white Francophones honestly and truly feel oppressed, and if not more oppressed than the Indigenous people here. So that has something really impactful within the dynamics here of that Indigenous people are very much second to white Francophone initiatives and concerns there, which you know, we have a provincial leader that does not consider systemic racism a real thing, or does not want to acknowledge that. So yeah, I think understanding your population and the kind of people around you does have something that really affects your organization and your kind of coalition. Thank you.
And thank you. Tom, I noticed you nodding your head lots as Leilani was speaking, so I'm going to pick on you next. What are your challenges been in the Battleford's, and where did you find your power to build the coalition?
It's a really good question. I want to thank Lindsay and Leilani for those great remarks leading into the story that I'm about to tell. Common challenges, I think, coming out both from Lindsay and from Leilani: racism. It's the elephant in the room. It's something we're all dealing with. We're working in a racist province with a racist prime minister, and more or less open hostility from the provincial government to the types of programs we're trying to put forward. So I think that's what I'd like to talk about with my time. And also to touch a little bit on the COVID point, which is another common challenge I think we're all facing across the country. So when I moved to the Battlefords, or when I moved to Saskatchewan rather in 2020 to take on work with this coalition, just during the coalition had just incorporated right in the middle of COVID, trying to build relationships over COVID, very difficult. So one of the things that our coalition took on doing was biweekly health calls with all levels of government. So with ISC, First Nations Inuit Health Branch, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, Indigenous health authorities, and then all of our leadership, meeting on a biweekly basis. And those calls served a couple functions. So they helped give the coalition some coherence, purpose, in a practical sense, coordinating some governance stuff. But a really important part of those calls was, and for our municipal leaders, for our people in the provincial health authority, was to hear about the racism in the healthcare sector that the members of our member nations are facing on a regular basis. And I think just constantly having those conversations on a bi-weekly basis really drilled some of that stuff home. So in March 2021, on the day of a BRCC board meeting, one of our mayors actually on the way to the board meeting found a bunch of posters around the Battlefords with all kinds of just vile white supremacist, Hitler was right, white is right, this kind of stuff. And that really lit a fire under us to do something to address racism in the region. So actually through NUIC, we managed to connect with a really wonderful group of anti-racism practitioners in Saskatoon that we started using to do anti-racism training with governments and kind of key organizations in our region. So we worked with both of our municipal governments, their councils and their admin, the RCMP, the school divisions. We have plans to work with the health authority. But so anti-racism training became a big kind of output of that process, and something that our leadership was primed to support, including both of our members, because they had already been hearing on a regular basis the struggles with racism and systemic barriers that our urban Indigenous members are facing on a day-to-day basis. That training isn't enough. We're trying to roll it into developing a regional anti-racism action plan, which we learned a couple of weeks ago, Saskatchewan declined to fund. So we're looking for alternative sources of funding to move that work forward. But again, with the supports of our mayors, with the supports of our chiefs, and just making sure that those conversations about systemic barriers and racism don't slip into the background, but become an active focus for our programming and our day-to-day kind of operations. Another thing that has come out of some of that work is related. So those conversations on those health calls about systemic barriers in the healthcare system led to us developing a project that's about doing community engagement on that very issue. So we're actually on February 27th, we're going to start with the open houses that are a part of that project, but doing some engagement with our members on identifying what the systemic barriers are within healthcare, but also education and recreation in the region, where the gaps in services are, and to generate a report that would basically tell us how we can collaborate, develop new programs, initiatives, partnerships to address some of those gaps. It's exciting work. I'm excited to get it started, but I also realize that I might be coming up on the end of my time here, and I want to leave time for Tanya as well. So maybe I'll leave the details. If there's room in the questions, we can go back to it then. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tom. And Tanya, over to you on how Victoria's built and strengthened itself.
Yes. So I really enjoyed hearing everybody's stories, and what I kept thinking about when I'm hearing about your challenges, and you know, not to say that Victoria is a utopia of any sort, but we are experiencing a lot of support right now. BC enacted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in November 2019. So we are quite a few years into our work in that space. And you know, while there's still systemic barriers and, you know, the community, what people experience in the community, that racism that's out there, there's a will to be at the table. And I think that that's at least something that we're all starting from a place that we know things have to change. And I think that's a really a good place to start from. And while we might get battle, you know, the pushback on how we do it or what we're saying about our community, you know, I think everybody agrees that. And so we, you know, when we started this journey in March 2018, our Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation came to the Friendship Center and to Ron Rice, who was our executive director there, and said, you know, like, we need to be active in reconciliation, and we need to be moving forward in a really, you know, like in an intentful way. And so we formed this, we gathered people, we gathered community, and we were like, basically, we were like, what's reconciliation? What is this thing? And it's so nebulous. And we kind of sat around kind of looking at each other. And we weren't really sure. And we talked, and we had another meeting, and we talked. And it took us about 3 or 4 meetings to really figure out what it was that we wanted to do as a group. And MER stepped up with the funding to enable that conversation. And it was really interesting because when it came to making the agreement, and we know how those go, we had no deliverables because we had no idea where it would take us. And they agreed to that, and they allowed us to pursue a project and a conversation and an approach that was not formed yet. And we really allowed it to be organic to our community. And so we grew the conversation very organically. We had the steering committee that had formed of about 15 people, and we had municipalities and the Capital Regional District and representation from MER and also from ISK and the federal government. And we had the Métis Nation of Greater Victoria, elders, young people, artists, and the steering committee. And they were like, we have to hear from our community because we don't know. And that's part of the challenge in the space, I think, is that reliable data, and why I'm so excited about these types of opportunities to gather information from people, record it, have it available to revisit and look back on. The Knowledge Hub, all of those things I think are really important because, you know, government wants reliable data so we can go to Treasury Board and change our approaches. But, you know, data has been such a challenge to our community in a very traumatic way. And so having to get back into that space now is a reality, but we want to do it in our own way, in our own approach. And so as we are cultivating some of that now in Victoria, that access to information about who we are and who is in this place that we're trying to serve, we're also just experiencing a lot of support to be in that space and to move forward. And so, you know, hands up to BC as a province for wanting change. And so a lot of our work is kind of focuses on two different streams. There's the social repair. That's the, like, what do we do right now to make the lives of our community members better today? How do we help them today? And then there's a systemic change. How do we make sure that the next few generations aren't still needing the same social repair? And so we've been sort of trekking down these two paths at the same time, because we have had the tendency in community to hyper focus on social repair and caring for our community members, but we have to allow ourselves the time to also focus on the systems change. And so for us, it really came down to education, so that we could mobilize a larger segment of our community to be active in this space with us. You know, we're 5% of the population as Indigenous people. Many of our community members are on their own healing journeys and cannot be active in the space with us. Many are on other journeys that are not leading them into the space with us. So we need to mobilize our allies in the community to be part of this journey and this work with us. And so we have created sort of education spaces that are accessible to everybody in the community, so that they can feel empowered and informed enough to actually go out and engage in reconciliation. And I know reconciliation is sort of this nebulous term, like I already said, but for us, when I saw that graph from Task, and it had all of the icons of everything they were doing, you know, that's reconciliation for us. It's not one thing. It's got to be a lot of things happening at once. And so we need people in those systems, in education, in justice, in the government, in all of these spaces that want to change and that have the capacity to learn enough to change. Because the systems don't change, people change the system. We need people in the system to reach that tipping point where they are informed enough and empowered enough to do so. And I know that's a challenging space, because we don't want non-Indigenous people speaking on our behalf. And so that's what the education is for. You know, where is that line where I could be an active ally without sort of breaching that space into what is Indigenous voices space? And so that's really been the foundation of our approach. We want to include as many voices at the table. Again, always making sure there is one safe space at our urban Indigenous leadership table for that Indigenous focused voice when it's needed, and to lead all the other spaces, really. But for us, we want everybody to have the same opportunity to be informed enough to participate. And so we've really we've rolled out some community learning program, the Friendship Center. We've also borrowed from the Friendship Center their capacity, their reputation, their relationships in the community, because they've been here for 53 years. And so while we aren't incorporated, we aren't an entity like most coalitions. And our community hasn't asked for that. And if they did, then that would be the direction we go in. But right now, we're really enjoying the space of connecting, knowing who each other are, and encouraging more voices to the space, because we've had a lot of, community members reveal that, I didn't, for a long time, I didn't say I was Indigenous because I didn't feel entitled to that identity. For whatever journey of there have been on, whether, through Indian assimilation policies, colonization, 60s group, all of these reasons people feel disconnected. So we're really trying to re-empower that group of people and reinforce their own indigeneity that they're entitled to. And again, increasing the volume of voices in the space that are working together to create change in our community. And I think that's about my time.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for those reflections on the wonderful work you've been doing. We will momentarily take a 10-minute break, and I would remind everyone, after we come back from the break, question and answer session. Please type your questions in the chat box. I know I've got a couple bouncing around in my head that I might write up during the break. But again, as we go to break, I want to thank all four of you for the really fascinating, inspiring thoughts you've shared with us all. So on that note, we will break.
Hi, folks. Welcome back. As we get going, I'll just mention a few things at the top. Chelsea and I were just mentioning about the toolkit and some notes today from this really riveting conversation about all the science and the experiences and the struggles and the successes of coalitions. So just a heads up that we are building a coalition toolkit, and Chelsea and I are involved in that with the Knowledge Hub. Chelsea, do you want to add any thoughts? I know you've been one of the editors of it, and Chantal Spicer from the Knowledge Hub as well, done a lot of good work in building it. But we're kind of, I guess, 80%, 90% done, and it'll be circulated across the country through the Knowledge Hub and in a printed form as well.
Yeah, so this toolkit was actually a major, a goal or deliverable of the Newark organization for some time. I think what was important to coalitions when looking at developing a resource for themselves was to make sure that it included perspectives of, Indigenous perspectives of the way that they'd like to work together and the way that they work to solve problems within their community. So with that in mind, this speaker series event as well is going to be used as a bit of a resource tool in that toolkit itself. So taking some learning outcomes from the conversation today and the questions asked and answered here to help inform and provide some resources for coalitions emerging and also established that maybe can benefit from the experience of what other groups have gone through. We recognize that all collectives across the nation have very different circumstances, as you've seen here today, but also that there are some very common themes and the challenges that urban Indigenous community members face across the country. So we know solutions won't work the same in one place for the other, but that perhaps there's things to learn. With that being said, please, we're really excited to hear some thoughts and questions from the audience, and thanks for being a part of today.
Yeah, I think there's the beautiful parallels around coalition structures and coalition governance and traditional Indigenous governance. So there's much to unpack, both in the kind of busy urban organizational worlds that we live in, where there's a lot of pressure to conform to sort of organizational dynamics and funder pressures and so-called accountability systems, versus traditional forms of governance. So coalitions perhaps are a beautiful way to hold Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous forms of governance while also doing the work in very challenging colonial urban contexts.
Indeed. Thank you, Erwin. Thank you, Chelsea. And it's true that coalitions are fascinating, at best, organic structures to build unity. And one of the questions on the break was to ask the panelists if your coalition members have negotiated a sort of basis of unity, a common bond of action, and if it needs to be renegotiated periodically to keep unity, to keep inspiration, to keep energy. What thoughts do any of you have about that? Let's see who jumps in first.
Maybe I can go.
Sure, go, Melanie, please.
Something that I've definitely noticed. I've only been working in the sector for I'm going into my 6th year now. But within those 6 years, I have seen a significant amount of changes for the organizations, for their mandates, for their programs, all really wonderful, positive things, changes in their board, changes in their staff. And I think one thing that we really have to always remind them and have them remind us is that we are really working towards a common goal. And whether or not, people, it's the same people around the table, it's always that same common vision. And you kind of just have to respect your members when it comes to level of engagement. That's one thing that I've noticed as well, is through certain periods of the year or certain years even, you'll have more engagement and more kind of having that spark and that fire from more organizations when it's really about something that they're passionate about. And you have to encourage that and be there to support that. But, you know, when they are going, whether it's organizational structure changes, or they could be moving, or they could be working on a big project, their level of engagement may dip a little bit, but that's okay. And I think we really have to be mindful that they are the front, like my organization, we're not frontline workers. We don't work directly with community members. And that doesn't take away the power of the work that we do. I think it really helps us focus on what needs to get done. That's probably less, it's more of a long-term goal. You really don't see the impacts of our work right away. It takes years to really see that. It's kind of like more of a, it's not a sprint, it's a race. And throughout that, so many people come and go due to so many different things, and that could be burnout, because, you know, they're working with community members, and they kind of take on that trauma that they work with. And organizationally, what I've seen as well is sometimes that trauma can manifest within organizations, and it's our job to really support that where they are, and kind of have them come in and feel supported as needed by us. So that's, I don't even remember if that answered your question, but hopefully it does.
Yes, thank you. Others' thoughts on the basis for unity?
Yeah, I'd like to share a little bit. Our coalition, I mentioned, we started with a listening activity for several years where we were gathering community, and we were gathering them in increasing size. So our first gathering was 40, our second was 80, and our final event pre-COVID, it was literally the last thing I think everybody in our community attended before everybody started hibernating for COVID. And so it almost perpetuated the conversation about it, because people kept reflecting on the event, but that was 160 people. So we kept doubling each time to get more voices to the table. So at the end of our listening activity, we were able to create this reconciliation blueprint for our city. And this is taking in everything we heard over the street. And there's a series of reports that start, you know, really synthesizing what we were hearing from everybody in our community. And what we realized is that there was 4 main spaces that people could take action in: relationships, education, systems change, and physical spaces. And other people have mentioned this too, about losing buildings and not having a space to gather in urban spaces, no cultural center, no health clinics and things like that. So physical space is a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of being able to gather and be a community and have that sense of community. And the Friendship Center is great, but they are, you know, are full. First of all, we're bursting at the seams, but, you know, this space we're cultivating here is different than the Friendship Center. The Friendship Center is a service agency looking to wrap people in opportunities that, you know, progress them along the wellness spectrum, where this is a reconciliation effort for us to heal in a different way together. So I did see somebody asking about education and how we mobilize people through that. And so we have done a lot of work in that space. And so I wear the other hat at the Friendship Center. I do direct a team called Community Action and Learning. And so when our group over here at the coalition has ideas about things we can do in community, then I take it over here. And with my team at the Friendship Center, we think about ways that we can implement them, because we aren't, as I said, an incorporated entity. So we need a legal body to hold and host and guide us with our agreements that we get to do actual programming. So our community learning program is a 3-day in-person with a half-day online orientation. It's a mixed learning environment for Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners. And it was originally created with the concept of having, we get a lot of volunteerism brought to us at the Friendship Center, and it takes capacity to use a volunteer successfully. And we also want to ensure their experience is a really positive one, as well as helpful to the capacity we need at the Friendship Center. And so from that perspective, we had started creating this curriculum, but it really became more about how we work successfully as a multicultural society in urban spaces, because we have Métis and Inuit and First Nations. We have like 80 different First Nations represented in the city. And so we're a multicultural community. And then when you add in there, you know, in non-Indigenous people, and as well as new Canadians and everybody, we want to, you know, create safe spaces where we can all learn together. And again, so we bring people together and they learn about, you know, working successfully in Indigenous spaces together. And so some of that is very simple, like learning about, you know, it's making mistakes, accepting feedback, you know, boundaries, consent, and healthy boundaries. And because we want to make sure these relationships always progress positively and aren't being impacted by cultural barriers, things we don't know about each other, things we don't understand about each other yet. The other thing about that is that they come to the Friendship Center for 3 days. It's over a period of 3 weeks. They come every Tuesday for 3 days, for 3 weeks. And by the time that they have a relationship with our Friendship Center, we have a public lending library. They sign up, become members of the library, and start reading the books. We have a volunteer program. They register, they come, and they serve our community lunch every Friday. We have these other outlets. So once they learn, we actually have action opportunities for them to go out and start doing things. And so while when we say, you know, mobilizing for reconciliation, again, it's so all encompassing. We can be talking about, you know, really serious crisis needs that we're dealing with, all the way to that social and cultural exchange piece that is so important when we build a community. So we do have this blueprint. It came out in the summer of 21, so it's just a year and a bit old. We do have intentions to revisit it ongoing. It's a living document, continue to breathe life into it. But basically people can take this, and if they focus in one area or all areas, we know that we're working together in a direction that we're heading. And so it's really been something that people feels grounds us together. And again, it's about creating that connection. And so they feel connected to each other through this document and through these shared words that they can now use to express this very complicated space of reconciliation.
Thank you. Other thoughts from our panelists?
I'll go
Yes.
ahead. In terms of unity, which of course is not always 100%, you know, filled with harmony and balance in the ways that we certainly would hope for. But I think for task, what holds us together, the glue that binds us is shared and common purpose. I think folks keep coming back to the table. I think there is, fortunately enough, trust, respect, and care for folks around the table, and enough respect to understand that though each agency has its own respective mandate, its own board, its own community members, its own geolocations, its own diversity, its own history in terms of longevity and how long they've been around, they come together with, you know, those diverse experiences, thoughts, and opinions. And I think through a shared set of values like the ones you're looking at here on screen, it helps to mobilize the work in a good way. And when we can't always arrive at consensus, I think that, again, we have, you know, relationships that allow for us to work through where there may be differences in opinions on things we want to sort of set out to achieve together. I would also say, like, in terms of the work that we actually do on like a day-to-day, I was listening to some of my friends who are sharing today in terms of what they're operating with, and 20 staff, that's awesome. For you, I think that Task has really been operating really on a sort of meager budget with a small scale for a really long time. So a lot of our members often will step in to support some of the operational and administrative functions of the work, as do consultants from time to time. But the work of Task, by and large, is connected to all of these and then some, but it really is about helping to support and bring together coalitions and help us to sort of make decisions such that they are influenced by the communities that those agencies are serving. So Task recognizes that it doesn't speak for the entire community of Toronto. what task is able to do is advance the things that we understand are happening at a local level by way of what each member agency is advancing. And sometimes things will come up in terms of commonalities. For instance, during pandemic, we struck a series of issues tables for support to the members, because things that were coming up for a majority of members during that time were concerns around making sure folks were housed, or that they had access to food provisions, or childcare supports, or a whole host of other factors. And so we struck these issues tables to help to mobilize and support those members in being able to, again, in unity, move forward on common issues of interest. And so, yeah, I think it just to sort of go full circle task for us, it's about coming together with one mind, one heart, and trying to move through issues by consensus as best as possible. We are also linked to other coalitions across Ontario who respectively do the same. We don't have a formal governance model of any kind. We just come together to share information, to learn from each other. And we have really good working relationships that, again, I think are grounded in reciprocity, respect, trust, all of the key ingredients that you need to have unity in respectful relationships. Yeah, I'll go. Thank you.
And if I can just add a few thoughts to close that off, Ian.
Yes, of course.
And thank you to Tanya, Leilani, and Lindsay for those insightful comments. I think one of the things that I've heard from those comments, and what I wanted to say about the basis for creating unity, is that it's always a reconstruction. It's always a renewal. It's something that has to be worked on over and over and over and over again. So when our coalition formed, we signed a framework agreement that ostensibly sets out the basis for unity in establishing what the governing principles and priorities of the coalition were going to be. But you cement those and you create unity through the project work itself. So if the purpose of our coalition, as it's spelled out in the Saskatchewan Relationship Agreement, is working to foster the health, growth, and well-being of all residents in the Battlefords regional community, it's really about delivering projects that specifically speak back to those principles and show how they're being put into action. For instance, we're just in the tail end of delivering a regional emergency management plan for all of our member communities. We talk about how our coalition is committed to the health and well-being of everybody in the community. Part of that is having basic protections in place for emergency circumstances. And so I think by delivering projects that are specifically speaking back to your mandate and explicitly doing it in the way that I communicate with my board and my leadership council, I think that creates the kind of foundation for ongoing commitment, as leadership is kind of seeing that these principles aren't just principles that are floating around in vision statements or planning documents, but are actually like the rubber is meeting the road at a certain point, and we are rolling out projects that are focused on real change. Another way to develop regional unity, and I was thinking about this as Lindsay was talking, it's actually kind of a negative criteria in the sense that it's something not to do. One way that we've held things together is that at no time does my coalition kind of give off the disposition that we are representing the member communities that we work with or speaking on their behalf. Never, ever, ever. So the name of the game for us is building respectful government to government relationships. That means we speak with, we work with, but never on the behalf of, and never as a representative of. Ultimately, it's the nations themselves that are the rights holders, and I think that needs to be kind of enshrined in the processes and in the communications, the terms of communications for the organizations. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good thought, Tom. I'm going to smush together a few questions. When Tanya was talking before the break, she talked about the importance of finding space and time to allow people to think in terms of system change. Imagining system change takes creativity. And I'm just curious how you mobilize, educate, inspire your members, the community as a coalition to exercise that creativity, to inspire them to have voice about the utility of their ideas. One individual asked about the place for youth. The creativity of youth is fabulous. How do you strategize on tapping into that capacity and inspiring creative thinking about making your worlds or your little corners of the world better, more just places? And again, anybody who wants to start us down this road, I'd appreciate it.
I'll jump in first here. Thank you for all the questions in the chat, and it's really been an interesting chat. Yeah, systems change, not easy. Everything's a system. And systemic racism, it's designed to be invisible, right? It's designed to be hard to see and to separate out from the system. And so part of that journey of systems change is opening people's eyes, and I mean all Canadians' eyes, to the fact that we are a colonized country and a colonized people. And everybody that lives in Canada is colonized. And perhaps you are aligned with the values of the colonizers. Maybe that's your heritage, that's your lineage, that's your cultural background. And so that would make sense you support it. But overall, a lot of Canada is comprised of people who are not British. And so when we open people's eyes to that reality, I think that helps us move the pendulum. Because again, for us, if we can impact the people in the systems, then we can start impacting the systems. And so first, helping people understand that if we want to decolonize, everybody needs to participate in that, because as a country, we are a colonized country. And then the other piece of work there is to, and I can't say this enough, to educate people and provide tools and things that are led and designed by Indigenous people, but in a way that enables allies to be part of that change. As people, what we envision is at some point, let's say in the education system, once you get to 51% of people in there that have opened their eyes to these system barriers and systemic racism, then we have a tipping point of where we can start to instigate those change. It's hard to change things you can't see. If you don't see an obstacle, it's hard to deconstruct it. But once you start opening people's eyes to the systemic racism and the obstacles that exist in it, then it's hard to stop seeing those obstacles, and anybody that works in systems, can probably attest to that. Once you start seeing how these things are structured and put together, you can see the obstacles a lot more readily, and then you can work on them. So I think a lot of it is just helping people open their eyes to the reality of the system that we are functioning in, how they are a part of that system, and then what they can do to start influencing it. And it's not an easy journey. And in BC, it took 150 years for us to become to the current state of our community, and it may take 150 years to back ourselves out into a space where we're comfortable and sharing the responsibilities of the territories that we live in. But we have to keep moving. And so, slow or not, I think we are making progress in terms of reaching our community members and enabling them to start seeing those obstacles that exist in our community.
Thank you, Tanya. Other thoughts?
Maybe if I can jump in there, Ian. I think just to build off of what Tanya was just saying, I think part of the way that you sort of energize yourself for system change and not get paralyzed in trying to deliver system change is kind of comes from a couple things. So one, which Tanya was talking about, it's really about dragging those systems into the cold light of day to kind of be exposed for what they are. So systemic racism is a structure that kind of counts on being invisible or being unspoken. It's about speaking about it and kind of dragging it out at the level of leadership and making people talk about it, quite frankly. I think one of the ways that our coalition tries to work on system change, by we work at the level of leadership largely, so less of the sort of boots on the ground level service provision stuff, and more working with mayors, chiefs, and their councils, getting public commitments from the mayors, getting public commitments from the chiefs to some of the projects, principles we're working on. And so when you're trying to, like in our case, trying to get our municipal members to develop anti-racism action plans. It doesn't matter if the city manager thinks that that's a bogus idea or isn't on board if the mayor has publicly committed to doing it. If council is giving the city manager those marching orders that they have to develop a plan. And so I think creating those kind of public commitments in our case has been something that's worked in both identifying systems that need to be dismantled or addressed, but then also creating the grounds for effective action, hopefully. I don't know if that answers the question, but I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. Leilani, you seem to have thoughts bubbling about this in your brain, so please share.
Yeah, I think when it comes to kind of making a really impactful systemic change, at least in our case, it has really come down to having not only people taking the time to listen to you, whether that's governments or other, but they have to believe you. They have to believe that the issues that you're bringing to them are in fact co-signed by the community. They have to believe that your solutions are the best solutions. They have to believe that Indigenous people know more than them. And it's, especially when it comes to Indigenous issues, like of course we know more than them. Why wouldn't we? But we have to, but having those people there is really, really, really important. Thankfully for us, we were able to get those people on board with supporting our projects, or looking inside their systems to find ways that they can fund our projects, or so we can carry over funding or develop a new project on a whim. Having those internal people who go up to bat for you within the system is one of the factors that really makes the work that you're doing less exhausting.
Yes, in unity there is strength indeed. Lindsay, your thoughts?
I was thinking about what you were saying, Tanya, because I often say the same, in that systems are built and maintained by humans. And until humans change, systems won't. And so I feel like so much of it really is changing systems at a heart level and helping to elicit empathy, because Canada, by design, educated generations of an entire nation, miseducated, in fact, about our true history. It was really, in my mind, post RCAP, post TRC, post MMIW. I mean, I think there's so much awakening happening across the country, but there's still so little known about who we are, why we matter, and what are our rights, responsibilities, and why are the conditions for Indigenous folks who live in this country still not faring as well as other humans who live here. And so I feel like those hearts and minds have to change from apathy to empathy. I think that will take time. You said something about 150 years. I do agree that, if we look at even the last 400 years, if it took us this long to even get to this point in the conversation, we're finally raising the flag and we're finally seeing, transformation in UNDRIP, for instance, out west, but yet nothing out here in Ontario, depending on the government of the day, depending on a whole host of other factors. Hearts and minds have to change fundamentally. And I think where Task has seen success is through good allyships, good relationships with people who genuinely care, are genuinely empathetic, who want to learn, who want to grow, who want to support. And those relationships have to be ready, reciprocal, and respectful. And by design, as humans, I believe personally that we're just not all made for each other. We're not made for everybody. Everybody's not made for me. I'm not made for everybody. And so sometimes that's tricky, right? Like you'll find those that are willing to work with you and wanting to work with you. And then you'll find other instances where there will be resistance for whatever reason. And so it's really, I think, about finding who your people are, who are your supporters, who are the relationships that you have out there that you can call upon for support. Task is very fortunate, I think, with the diversity of members, in that within the orbit of Task, we have, contacts with the mayor's office and certain divisions of the city. If we need to host a roundtable or a key issue item that comes up, we do have certain folks we can call upon. Conversely, there are some folks we would never call upon, simply because the relationship is absent, and despite every best effort to build it, we can't for whatever reason. And so I really do think it's about finding common ground, I think it's about creating space for empathy and finding, what it is that it aligns. One thing I really learned and I take away professionally from the pandemic experience was, long gone are the days where funders are saying, hey, we'll give you some money, that $30,000 and you can give us a 12-page report, as you talked about earlier. No, please give us some funding to support our initiatives and create space for self-determination. Moreover, let's not just take your money. Let's have a relationship. Let's also look for alignment within that relationship, because if we don't share the same understanding or set of values, if you're not educated on the issues, why do we want to take your money? Because it's got to be more than just that. Relationships have to be meaningful. Yeah.
Very good thoughts. And one of the things that inspires me in what you're saying is thoughts of the importance of community control, community self-determination, community self-definition in addressing whether it's particular issues or it's bigger systemic issues that, as Leilani said, Indigenous peoples know about way better than folks who look like me. Part of it, I sit here thinking, wondering how allies, how folks who look like me can be valuable to Indigenous peoples, be true supporters, and not inject ourselves. Please give me guidance.
Everyone's very polite. We're all waiting to see if the other person's going to go first. Yeah, that's a really great question. And seriously, it's something I get asked a lot. And I think it was Montreal that published an Allies pamphlet that we started with here. We used that as our starting point. But I think the number one thing I say about allyship is that it comes from community, that recognition of it. And so to gain that recognition, it's about being present. It's about showing up and being consistent in that showing up and doing some of the hard work and the dirty jobs that need to be done. Like I said, we have community lunch every Friday. It's a wonderful opportunity for anybody in the community to come and eat a meal together. And we have 10 volunteers every Friday show up and serve and clear and do the dishes and, get their hands dirty and really contribute meaningfully to people who might be their only sit down meal with other people for the week, if for some people. So you really need to be willing to put in that time and show up, like go to openings at galleries, go listen to live music, so volunteer at the community events, go to the Indigenous Resource Center library, whatever you might have in your community. When your face starts being present, people will start remembering you, and then they'll start inviting you into spaces more and more, and then they'll start recognizing you as an ally. And that's when you've really sort of made it into the space fully. There's a lot of steps of learning that happen for that person as well. But like from a community perspective, when I see someone, with the sincerest intent showing up and being present and asking, reasonable questions, but not asking too much of us either, then that's somebody that I call on and I continue to invite back and I continue to open the door for. And we need the support. I can't say this enough. In our community, we're 5% of the population, and the whole community has to, decolonize. And so we need allies, and we want to open the door to them. And then, the education piece, of course. But I think it's that relationship building and being present and putting the time in to say you do have a relationship with the Indigenous community.
And I too have seen the allyship toolkit from Montreal, and it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of guidance for folks who look like me. So thank you for that. Other thoughts?
Not other thoughts, but it was kind of to answer two of the questions that I seen in the chat.
Sure.
One was about how to engage with urban Indigenous youth, as well as it was something talking about research or reports. And this is something that's very, very important to me. I've been a part of this project from, from the creation of the funding application to getting the funding to launching the report to now we're in the second phase of that. And what I'm not going to go over the full report because it's going to be too long, but just kind of some key things that made that project really special is we really created low barrier access to urban Indigenous youth. So there was no pressure for them to participate at a regular rate. We definitely went through many different youth who were able to give what they wanted to give at a rate that made sense to them. We remunerated all of the youth for their time. So we paid them all $20 per hour, whether that was to actively participate in dialogue, to participate in meetings, to participate in professional development, whether that was job shadowing. And what I've really noticed and what they've definitely told us is having the door open for them was really appreciated with very low pressure, but also the ability to become or to have stability was really appreciated. And from that youth advisor program, so we had a program of different youth advisors. Now two are currently full-time employees at the network that we're really proud of. Both of them are very wonderful and bright and have so much lived experience. And when I say lived experience, they are both urban Indigenous youth who grew up in youth protection, who both did not graduate high school. But that doesn't mean because they have all these, preconceived notions of who they are, that doesn't mean that they can't give something valuable to the organization. So that came with a lot of confidence building, a lot of skill building, a lot of time and dedication and mentorship that I could not imagine a better investment in the community than that. So that was really, really beautiful to see. And we're so excited to continue this program. Actually, we have an event tomorrow with youth to help them build pilot projects that they care about. We already did all the research, so we don't have to just discuss things for the sake of discussing it. It's more about what's the second phase of that storytelling? How can we begin implementing solutions that they want to do? And yeah, so that's going to be a very exciting project over the next, I think we have 2 years of that project, but we're already in talks to extend it and to have another multi-year project. And it's one of the projects I'm probably most proud of.
It sounds pretty wonderful. Other comments from our panelists? There was a comment here that makes me both smile and inspires me. Someone commented about written reports. They're told by an elder, if I see one more written report, I will use it for my ceremonial fire. Sounds like a wonderful idea to me, because chasing approval by writing reams of paper is not self-determination. So I do think we all need to think about how to create an environment against the intent of system change, how to create an environment in which coalitions are a source of the expression of self-determination. How have you been creating helping to create self-determining communities, helping to give voice to a sense of community self-determination where you've been working.
I think for us, we during the pandemic, as I expressed earlier, we saw ourselves sort of transitioning from administrative support to members predominantly being the work, to suddenly, writing dozens of proposals in haste, trying to ensure that members felt supported, because we knew that we were in strange times where, in fact, the needs of community don't stop because we're in a pandemic. And so we're very cognizant of that. And so we took up the responsibility, which was new territory for Task, in fact, to actively fundraise at the permission and on behalf of the members at their direction. And so we did do that work. And the funding that members received, as I said earlier, that really was self-determined by each member. So it wasn't, the red tape that we've seen traditionally with respect to funding relationships. And so that self-determination, the model we created was a concept of, take what you need and leave what you don't. Each member had equal access and equal shares to the funding that we were bringing in. And agency size, you could have been an agency of, a staff of 5 or an agency of a staff of 300. What we saw were, there were differing responses in terms of some agencies went out and purchased vehicles and hired folks from community to go out and deliver food and to make sure that outreach was being conducted and that folks were being supported in the ways in which they needed to be. And so we've now sort of been building out this notion of greater self-determination with respect to funding so that we can move away from the old bureaucratic or Western way of doing things with respect to receiving funds to manage things at a local level, because those needs are ever evolving. What community needs today could change tomorrow. And it looks very different depending on the organization. We also have a number of grassroots collectives and others who are activating different support work and responses in Toronto. So it's quite a diverse makeup in terms of organizations doing their part to support their community members and other folks who are stepping up to do the same. And so to me, self-determination in a place like Toronto, I think, is that we do have a lot of folks who are actively doing work to support the people in their own self-determining ways. And that's growing, that concept of self-determination in a way that, we're not looking at the ways in which we were dictated to by funders or by governments or by other parties. I think we're starting to author solutions to our own outcomes in the ways that we think are best.
Wonderful, thank you. Others? Tom, your thoughts? Given you've described that you are confronting a rather intransigent provincial government, shall we say, how do you get your elbows out to make space for self-determination for the folks you work with?
It's a really good question, and I think that is something that we're still figuring out, again, as a young organization that's only been around for the past 3 years. I think we're still kind of making the road by walking it when it comes to that question. I think when you talk about self-determination, I think I immediately just start thinking about resources and capacity. In order to be self-determining, you need to have the resources and the capacity in order to be self-determining. And so I think our coalition is constantly looking for advocacy opportunities to advocate for more resources to get into our communities. And we take those opportunities where we find them. I mentioned earlier on this call the health calls that we started doing in response to the pandemic. Just as we started those health calls, I think just before we launched them, our coalition had managed to get a meeting with Ministers Bennett and Miller when they had the ISC and CERNAC portfolios respectively. And through that meeting, we got them to commit to sending the RDG from ISC on our biweekly calls. So having that biweekly line right to the RDG, our leaders were showing up to those calls because in part they needed the latest news about COVID, they needed services coordinated, but they also had the RDG on the line and they could press him about their applications and about the services that they needed on those calls on a biweekly basis in front of an audience of other leaders who are advocating on their behalf. And partially as a result of some of that advocacy work and keeping pressure on the RDG from the collective. One of our nations, which has never been on the capital plan for this region since Treaty 6 was signed, got on the capital plan for the first time last year. And so just maintaining that constant pressure, using a collective voice for advocacy, which is something that I think we're all familiar with, and taking opportunities where you find them to get resources and capacity into member communities. Thank you.
Thanks. Other comments, or shall I move on to the next question, which may or may not prove to be our last? Interesting question for each of you. Do your coalitions have a sort of terms of reference that determine who becomes coalition partners, who joins in? Is there a place for organizations or collectivities that may not be incorporated, like, for instance, a youth collective? Again, thinking about how to grab hold of the incredible creativity of youth and help give them voice in making change for society. Is there a place for these maybe slightly nebulous groups or collectivities to help in the coalition space, and maybe as a consequence begin to solidify their identity as a collective?
I'll go first. I think we're different a lot from other people. We're not a structured organization, so we don't have incorporation or constitution or bylaws or anything like that. We really leaned into that organic space of self-selection and people self-nominating or being invited into the space if we identify them. Some of the work we have done, though, to make sure we have those other voices in the space with us is doing targeted activities and community engagement things with certain segments. So such as in Victoria, we don't have a lot of Inuit, but we do have a population, and we finally this year were able to host 2 different events. One was just a social cultural workshop for them alone, and then the next one we all came together and started to meet each other. And the same with our elders. The Victoria Native Friendship Center has a very active elders department. In the last fiscal year, we serviced 800 individual elders, and so we're starting to have, again, starting with building community, having events that are just to appreciate the elders. The next one we're having is an elders brunch on a Sunday. They said, oh, I come to the center all the time, but my family never gets to come or never gets to see my workshops, or because they're working and they're in school. So we're having it on a Sunday. We're asking them to bring their families. We're just going to eat and celebrate together. And then, we'll get to talking about UNDRIP and organizing and all of those things, but we're really, really focused and at the will of the community, at the relationship building and that connectivity. And if it gets to the point where we need a system and there's elections and structure, we can have that conversation. But people, I think, are really appreciating the organicness of it. And if the conversation's on homelessness, that's going to have a different group of people than if the conversation's on education or on justice or on, and so to have one set group of people sort of determining all those things hasn't really been our approach. It's like, this is the conversation this time. Open the doors. Who are the right people to come in? And we kind of joke, we say, everybody that lives here is part of our coalition. They just might not know it yet because maybe we haven't hit the topic for them, or that activity that draws them in, or that event that they go, oh, I got to go to that. But that's our goal. There's, what do they say, 415,000 people now in the Capital Regional District. And we want them all to be part of our coalition and actively thinking about how to improve our system for all the citizens. And what did it say, that rising tide raises all boats? So if we value the human rights of one person, we value it of everybody. If we improve the situation for Indigenous people in our community, we will improve the situation for everybody. Yeah, so that's sort of what my thoughts around that.
Great, thank you. Others?
Yeah, I can go. So
Yeah.
we kind of have just kind of what I'm hearing, we kind of have two different approaches. So for more formal things like AGMs, special AGMs, because we are incorporated, we do have a formal membership criteria. So all Indigenous people living in the Greater Montreal area are full voting members, so they can vote on, you know, any bylaw changes or membership lists or etc., as well as Indigenous organizations in the area of Montreal. So we had to go through a long kind of trying to make sense of what actually qualifies an organization to be Indigenous. So for us, we kind of have three different criteria. It's they have to have their board being mostly Indigenous. So I think like 50% plus one. A lot their admin and leadership, so EDs, team leads, project managers have to be Indigenous, again, majority. And then the majority of their members or the people that they serve have to be Indigenous. So we understand that, like, for structural reasons, there are different, you know, phases. Sometimes we consider organizations Indigenous. Sorry, that's my laundry. But for whatever reason, they don't have enough Indigenous board, and, you know, this could be like a long-term goal. So there does have to be a conversation there that we have, like there has to be full transparency. And then what we have is also, like, we have members who are non-voting. So this is non-Indigenous governments, different institutions like universities and others, and non-Indigenous organizations who don't meet the criteria, so they do not have voting rights. But any Indigenous person who lives in the Greater Montreal area can vote, and Indigenous organizations have a vote, so they can have a non-Indigenous rep that votes on behalf of the organization, so that counts. We did have to make the decision to, for AGM purposes, is not include Indigenous organizations not from the city of Montreal. This is mostly for reasons of, if they're not an urban organization, they have much different priorities than us, which can definitely impact the path that we have. And then on a more like informal, like any meetings that we have with partners, whether that's holding spaces or holding conversations regarding Indigenous healthcare or homelessness, it includes mostly organizations, frontline organizations, but it can also include different like team leads and others who are in the best position to speak on issues that really affect the organization. But again, and then through our other program, we support youth collectives or different youth, you know, who may not be incorporated, but we highly encourage them to partner up with an organization so that they can support them when it comes to project management, funding, etc. So we do that for the short term, but we really encourage youth to kind of develop their own partnerships and work with other organizations that probably align better with their programs or projects.
Thank you. So a couple more minutes before we should wrap. Any last thoughts from Lindsay or Tom?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So we operate by consensus, and we, regrettably, because of Western legislation, follow a set of bylaws, but we've blended in parallel to Indigenous concepts within our code of conduct. So when I say we operate by consensus, generally that is what happens within the structure of the council and the decisions that are made. And I think we're very fortunate in that we are able to tap into expertise and knowledge from each of the members around the table who have their own respective boards of directors, their own respective community members and processes, advisories, youth councils that they can also tap into to bring information back to the table. And we also create space and mechanisms by which we do endeavor to engage community through virtual mechanisms, mostly as of late, to collect and solicit feedback on specific priorities as they're coming up or projects as we're moving through things like that. And so I would say we've got sort of a combination of Indigenous values and concepts intertwined with legislative realities for us as an incorporated organization, which can sometimes, I think, be a tricky balance, because you certainly don't want to be beholden to the Western way of doing things or be stalled from being able to reach your full potential and self-determine the ways in which you think you should govern yourself as an institution or organization. But I think, like I said, we're very fortunate that we've got a lot of strong leaders around the table who definitely bring those different worldviews to the table to ensure that we're grounded in that. Yeah, well, thank you.
And if I can just offer some thoughts as well before we close out for today. Our organization, working to develop respectful government to government relationships, I think it was important for the people who designed our coalition to have a framework agreement in place kind of at the outset. And the reason for that is just having all the parties committed to something that would help ensure that the coalition lasts longer than the tenure of any one person in office, whether that's as mayor or as chief. So getting that commitment in place, I think, really important to the architects of our coalition. And then, yes, we do have bylaws that govern the way we function. We are incorporated as a nonprofit. The structure of those bylaws, it seems like kind of a technical thing, but is actually highly political. So in our region, we're surrounded by a bunch of small rural municipalities that at one point, one of the city managers from one of our urban members wanted to bring into the coalition. Our framework agreement has terms that allow for the entry of new members, and that's something that we're always looking for. But it's also important that the vote share on our board remains majority Indigenous governments, and that it's not majority municipal governments. And so our bylaws were structured in such a way that we could invite new small municipal governments to join our table, but they would effectively share a single seat on the board, so that they wouldn't have multiple seats that would dilute the Indigenous share on our board in terms of voting. There's probably more to say about our bylaws, the framework agreement that governs us. It's all very exciting and interesting stuff. But I do realize that we're kind of coming up on time here. So maybe I will just leave my contact information in the chat for this call. And if there's anybody who would like to see the framework agreement that we're working from, or has questions about our bylaws, anything, how any of that stuff works, I am open to taking those offline after this meeting. But I want to thank the other participants on today's panel, Leilani, Tanya, and Lindsay. I think I've learned a lot from all of your comments. I also want to thank Ian for moderating, Erwin for your role in putting this together, and especially Chelsea. I want to acknowledge all the work that you do in coordinating and moving things at a national level. It is appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I will turn it over to Erwin, but on my way of, as I bow out, I want to thank all of you for really inspiring, interesting, engaging thoughts and sharing your experiences with all of us. So thank you. Over to you, Erwin.
Yeah, we just want to give people a heads up that our next event will be live in Ottawa, but we're also inviting folks to join via Zoom. And I'll just bring that up. Chelsea, maybe you want to give people a heads up. There are some delegates from coalitions, and we're having a really exciting event in Ottawa. Maybe you can just give us a quick overview for folks who may be planning to attend to represent their coalitions.
Yeah, so for folks who here represent coalitions in your regions, we at the national group are having our first in-person national gathering of urban Indigenous coalitions since the COVID pandemic started. So we're really excited to finally be able to reconnect and meet with those able to travel. We'll be in Ottawa from March 1st to 3rd, visiting some of the local spaces at the Wabineau Center, but also taking over the Ottawa Art Gallery for a lot of our gatherings right downtown, and really looking forward to sharing and hearing from coalitions across the country and looking at the organization at the national level, as well as some really important topics such as UNDRIP implementation, Misquatus, the Misquatus case as a potential, legal pathway into advocating and fighting for the visibility, but also the fulfillment of Indigenous people's rights in urban centers, as well as some other really key juicy topics. So in terms of looking at data, mobilizing data and on a national level. So we're really excited to be able to welcome the representatives to this event, and we'll be seeing you there. And also for those able to join the next speaker series event, we're really excited to host that discussion on the Misquatus case as well. So.
And the registration link is in the chat box, so take a look at that. It just takes a few seconds to register. And there's also in the chat, there's a link to subscribe to the Eventbrite. So if you want to be notified immediately when we produce other events. And as we mentioned earlier, I'll apologize at the very beginning of the event. We kind of jumped in because we were confused whether everybody was joining us and whether we were missing passwords. So sorry for a bit of a rocky start there. But thanks to all of the panelists, and it's really lovely to have this level of expertise, people who are in the trenches doing this work day to day, and your insights will also help the Coalition's Toolkit that will be circulating. So follow our social channels, they're on the screen here, if you'd like to be notified when the Coalition's Toolkit is published. Ian, thanks so much for hosting today, and to all the speakers.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Friday.
Miigwech.
Thank you, Nyawa. Anna.
What do you want?
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers. Good to see you, Mike.
Yeah, good to see you guys too. See you, I guess, in a few weeks.
Yeah, see you soon.
Okay.